Hi everyone. So we are going to be talking about diverse student populations in higher education. To kind of give us a preface before we begin, the treatment of diverse student populations in higher education is rooted in much pain, assimilation, and racism. Diverse students include those of all abilities and backgrounds, ranging from racially, ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse backgrounds. In this lecture, we want to dive into topics regarding the intense assimilation of Indigenous peoples in early higher education, and shifting later to discussion connecting the history of Indigenous populations in higher education to the Latinx student community in the present day. It's important for us to understand how much of the history of higher education system affects the way students experience it today. History really informs the future of this topic, and as time goes on, student populations are becoming more and diverse and constantly changing, yet the historical prejudice that exists against students of color has not been erased. We must acknowledge the past in order to reach a greater understanding of the varying identities that create a campus, as well as create proper policy to support these identities in the right way. And as we go through this lecture, we encourage you all to think critically about how each event we talk about has shaped the next.
All right, we're first going to focus on the assimilation of indigenous people in higher education. As we see in the slides, the colonizers saw indigenous people as wild and savage, um, and believed they had the need to be civilized and baptized into the white religion. This idea of civilization of Native Americans grew popular within colonizers, where they even offered scholarships. Where they used to educate colonial students, um, inspiring them to become missionaries, uh, so they can teach other Native Americans and spread the word. This idea was tainted just because they saw the Native Americans as uncivilized due to the fact that they weren't assimilated into the white Western culture. Next slide, please. Initially, colleges were more than just an institution for higher education, but they were also a place of religion. Colonizers set the goal of starting Indian schools, which had similar college values, in the sense that they taught liberal arts and sciences, pushing their students to becoming part of the ministry. In the case for the white students, they were more likely to actually be in the clergy versus the Native American students. It was more of a way of just assimilating them. Like, yes, they were going to be part of the church, but they weren't going to have an official higher up position. It was more of a way to get them inside the church and then using them against themselves, to turn onto other Native Americans. However, natives in the classrooms usually didn't end well. Most of their stories ended in tragedy. Tragedy. So most of these students that did end up going to colleges and studying there for a while, they ended up with like different diseases such as like measles, leading to their death, or the consumption of alcohol to the point where they turned alcoholic. Um, and these like tragic events show that the institutions weren't adequate for other students unless they were from European origin. Clearly, they didn't care too much for their native students since there were such a low number of them involved. Um, as a result of this, many tribal leaders who once approved of the colleges and sending their kids into them, they eventually disagreed with this idea of sending them into colleges, and they didn't want them to attend. Ironically, natives believed that the colonizers instead should attend um, with the tribes and be more local so they could understand more about leadership. They really didn't believe in the whole Western world and how they viewed education. In the end, the colonizers' goal for students in higher education, it was different depending on their race. The white students were more focused on becoming more prestige and receiving titles and eventually becoming clergy of the church. Whereas for the natives, their curriculum shifted more towards assimilating them into American culture. So in a way, colleges and education was just a tactic that the white colonizers used so they can shift them into American culture so they can be considered civilized.
On the subject of education, our next focus will be more related to the land in which higher education institutions are built upon. We're talking about 11 million acres of indigenous land that held approximately over 200 tribal nations. And as you can see from the picture in this slide, you can see sort of the the ways in which this land was acquired by the U.S. from indigenous people. So you have, treaties, unratified treaties, which are just treaties that were never made official by the government, but just forced upon indigenous people to take their land. And even the treaties that were official, a lot of the times the U.S. would simply break them in order to take advantage and gain more of a benefit from the land of the indigenous people. And the 4% is just seizures, which are just the use of violence in order to get rid of indigenous people from their land and take it by force. And these seizures, we're talking about 160 violence backed treaties and land seizures to get this land. Land that to the present day, there are land grant universities in the West and the Midwest, for example, that still retain millions of acres, and they're making millions of dollars in profit, and that's profit that a lot of indigenous tribes never see. So to give an example of some of these events in which land was taken from the indigenous people, and these are just two examples of the many that exist. For example, Colorado State University, it sits on land that was taken from the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, land that was taken in the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, in which over 200 members of those tribes were murdered. And that land was just taken. And then when the Morrill Act in 1862 happened, that land was sold to the state of Colorado. And then Colorado State University was made. There was a big profit made. Again, we're talking about millions of dollars in profit. And there was basically no way to pay back to the people of those tribes for what they did to their people in that massacre. Then you have the University of Arizona, which has 150,000 acres, which was nearly all seized without payment from the Pima, the Yuma, the Navajo, and the Apache after the Apache Wars. So again, we see violence against indigenous people and their land taken from them to then make a profit later on when the Morrill Act happened to build these higher education institutions, which are supposed to, have all the people with the biggest inspirations and the greatest minds, as is usually said by these institutions. But at the same time, you see a lack of recognition of indigenous history in these institutions, which is ironic since the land that it sits on is a land of indigenous people that was taken from them. And so you see this Eurocentric history that is taught at these higher education institutions, which brings me to my next slide of tribal colleges and universities. So tribal colleges came to be after the tribal college movement, in which indigenous people felt that their opportunities for higher education were very limited. And to begin with, you have tribes living in reservations. So already geographically, there was no universities, higher education institutions that were near indigenous people. So they wouldn't be able to physically get to those institutions and get educated. But at the same time, they felt that in the traditional colleges, there was no recognition of their history, of their people. So oftentimes indigenous students just didn't feel like they were being taught things that were relevant to them. And so there was this demand for colleges that did exactly that, that taught the history of indigenous people, but also kept the culture alive. So languages, culture, all these things, so that indigenous students could feel like they were being taught something relevant to them. And then in 2011, President Obama signed an executive order that would improve tribal colleges and universities. And on top of that, also primary and secondary school, because the US felt that there was a big gap between Native students and non-Native students. And so this executive order would make it possible to work with Indigenous leaders that focus on education for Indigenous people in order to close that gap and to give the appropriate education to Indigenous people in order to, give them the necessary resources and to keep them on track and to, give them a better chance compared to the non-native students.
In comparison to the treatment of indigenous people, Latinx people experienced something similar. Mexican individuals were isolated into Mexican colonies where was reserved for them because they were not allowed to be mixed with white communities. In addition, similar to colonial colleges where indigenous people were taught separately, Latinx groups were placed in Mexican schools that were in terrible conditions. This meant that students attending these schools did not have quality education and experienced diminishing treatment from white people. California school boards claim that they put Mexican Americans in their own schools in order to help them assimilate to white culture, such as learning English. Instead of receiving specialized instruction to improve their language and academic skills, Mexican American students were trained to become field workers and house cleaners. 8 years before Plessy versus Ferguson, a Mexican family fought to end segregation in schools. This case was Menendez versus Westminster.
Okay, so thinking about all of the stuff that we covered in our lecture today, we have a couple of discussion questions that we want to have y'all think about and have a conversation about. So the first one is kind of thinking back to the beginning of our lecture. Why do you think religion played such a big role in the conversations we've had today? So not just how has religion played a role, but really like why? Why do you think religion is so deep rooted in this? Because that is a huge conversation to have. And then the next question we have for you after that one is, how has history shifted how Latinx populations have experienced higher education? We touched on this, but we really want y'all to delve into kind of how Indigenous history plays a role in it and potentially posit some questions about this history. But with that, that is the conclusion of our lecture. Thank y'all for listening.